Hey, Lee Burton here from Functional Movement Systems. Thank you for joining us on this live stream. Today I was actually supposed to be presenting at the American College of Sports Medicine's Health and Fitness Summit. But on Wednesday, like a lot of things, they ended up canceling the conference due to the growing concern over the virus. So we decided to go ahead and deliver the same presentation for you today. I want to thank our great staff for pulling this event together. Really, they did a lot to get this thing going and up. And during the stream, we're going to have some of our staff available to answer questions in the chat. Also, they'll pull some questions for me to answer during the live stream, so definitely try to get engaged. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to share some details about a special offer on our online education. So now let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about core training. And when you hear the word core training, or really when your clients, your patients hear core training, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Crunches, side planks, different types of activities that really isolate the abs in many situations. That's what people consider or think about when we talk about core training. What I'm going to focus on is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to focus on just the fundamentals and maybe some principles that we need to consider before we just arbitrarily prescribe some type of exercise. Now, there's nothing wrong with planks. There's nothing wrong with certain activities that are designed to really focus on the abs or the core, but we just need to have a better insight or some better ideas on when those are most appropriate. So we're going to first just start talking about what is the core. And I think, again, this is how we look at it, or how I would describe this to someone, is there's a couple layers. There's an inner and an outer, if we just look at the anatomic part of the core, what we see. And when we see or talk about the core, this is what most people assume. We're looking at that six-pack abs. We're looking at, what we're seeing, the lats and the obliques and those things. But we also have an inner core, and that inner core is just as important. We also need to consider what the neuromuscular system and how that involves the core and what that will do. Something as simple as gripping, squeezing your hand actually activates the core. Raising your arm will activate the core. So there's a neuromuscular component that we have to consider and how that activates or deactivates what's going on in our core. So we also need to consider what's the core's purpose. If we're going to train it, and we're going to try to make it more functional. Again, ultimately trying to get strength and performance, we need to really consider what is its actually purpose. So really, stability and postural control. That typically is what we need to think about with the core. It's talking about holding yourself up nice and tall. As I'm sitting here, I want to hold myself up nice and tall. My core is engaged. When I'm walking, my core is engaged to keep myself up nice and tall. So that's the postural control component. Energy transfer is also part of what we do and how the core functions. We need to think about things as something as big as jumping or throwing a kick or kicking or throwing a punch or throwing a ball. We're transferring energy from our upper body through our core to our lower body, or our lower body through our core to our upper body. So allowing that energy to transfer is how we function and perform at a higher level. If the core is not functioning properly, it will now not allow that energy to transfer as well. So that's a very important component. And of course, breathing. So one of the purposes of what we really consider the inner core is breathing. Is breathing functional or not? Because if breathing is dysfunctional, that may impact how functional the core is. If the core is dysfunctional, that may impact our breathing. So breathing is one of the most fundamental things we do. So we need to make sure and have an understanding that that is part of what we need to consider as we start looking at training the core. And then continence. We can't really talk about the core and the inner core if we don't at least have an appreciation of how continence, or our ability to control our bladder, impacts core training. If you had a client who maybe, a female client who had a baby in the past, when they jump rope or they do certain activities, they may have problems with continence. They may have a problem with that needs to be addressed. And if that's not addressed, then your core training is not going to be as impactful. They're not going to be as good. And there are certain medical professionals that are specifically trained on how to do that. So again, it's just a conversation and just that awareness of what impacts the core and how you need to train it. And if that's an issue, go ahead and refer to them to the right person that can give you some insight into what you can do. So now let's go back to that anatomic outer core component we're talking about, or we talked about earlier. Well, the outer core is really those large muscles that create movement that most of us consider when we're training the core, the lats, the glutes, the obliques, the adductors. You know, you have an anterior X, you have a posterior X, and how those crisscross, that's really where we create rotation, where that energy allows to get transfers from the upper and the lower body. And these are large muscles. These create a lot of force, a lot of compressive forces in and around our spine. That's what most of us typically consider when we talk about the core. Well, we have the inner core, and it's just as important. Both are important. The inner core is what we don't really consider a lot. That's really what allows the outer core to function properly. The inner core is the smaller muscles, more of these slow twitch type 1 muscles that create stability. So as I'm sitting here, if I go up and I want to sit up nice and tall for a period of time, these inner core muscles are really what's turning on. It's controlling the spine, controlling the pelvis to allow those bigger, more powerful muscles to do their job. And they really contract the outer cores, large compressive forces, a lot more maximum contraction. These guys are a little bit lower level. So we need to have an appreciation for both, because of the inner core muscles, these slower, these more proprioceptive type, non-directional, kind of anticipatory, what I guess up there, more reflex driven. So if I'm going to squeeze my hand, anticipating maybe opening a door or picking up an object, these little muscles react to that squeeze and they anticipate something happening. So squeezing my hand, my inner core muscles turn on, anticipating me lifting an object, opening a door. Those where the outer core muscles work. So these are just as important, and if they're not working properly, then we're going to have some problems. And that's what we need to start thinking about. What do some of these things actually do? And then the bigger thing is, maybe not the bigger thing, but another very important piece is how the neuromuscular system reacts and creates core stability. Again, reflex stabilization. When I'm punching or throwing, the inner core has to engage, and this is very much a neuromuscular aspect. And if we look at actually how we grew and developed, really we can go back to this neurodevelopmental series of how we went from being able to not even hold our heads up to walking in about 15 to 20 or so months. That's a very natural process. And that's how the core gets developed. And it's good to appreciate this process if we're going to identify a potential problem and train it correctly. Let's go back to these basics, because it doesn't really take a lot of coaching or cueing for an infant to go through this process. They can't even hold their heads up. They've got this big bowling ball sitting on top of 2 pencils where the core begins to contract, the muscles in and around our spine contract to hold the head up so they can look around. And again, it's for no other reason than to just react and respond to your environment. So the spine creates some control, and then lo and behold, we start rolling, we start crawling, we start sitting, and we go through these transitional patterns to where we go from kneeling or squatting to standing. And that's just a very natural process. And we need to use this process to our advantage to, again, think about how we may want to fix some of the problems we can identify. So we need to appreciate that. So a good example of this is a simple single leg stance. So right now, why don't you try this? Stand up, go into a single leg stance. So is that part of core training or core even testing? And if you watch the video here, you've got a pretty high level athlete who simply does a single leg stance. On one side, they do very well, but on the opposite side, they struggle quite a bit. And how many of you guys out there have the same issue? You stand on one foot, pretty good. Stand on the other foot, not so good. But will just an arbitrary core exercise fix this problem? Maybe not. There may be a lot of things going on, the reason this person, or you even, have an imbalance between the right and the left. But one of the first things we want to do is just make you aware of this issue, make you aware you've got a balance problem. So if we make you aware you have a balance problem in this example, then you're more likely to buy in, so to speak, to what we want to be doing. So something as simple as a single leg stance is a real easy way to check what your core is doing, and that's this inner core, reactive, reflexive. Are you doing the things you need to do? And think about the ankle for an example. For this person, it may be an ankle problem that may be the issue. Some people may just automatically want to go and train the glutes, train the core to create better single leg stance, but actually it could be an ankle issue. Some of the research out there will say the more hip extension you get into, the more you're going to use your glutes. But in order to get a hip extension functionally, you've got to have good ankle mobility. So if you don't have good ankle mobility, your glutes may not be doing what they need to do. They may be inhibited. They may not be contracting and activating like you need to do. So as you go and take a step, when you step, those hamstrings are pulling you forward. Once you get to neutral and start going into extension, well, now we know that now my posterior chain becomes more involved to propel me forward. But if I can't go into hip extension because I have a lack of ankle mobility, then my glutes aren't going to be working as much, and my hip flexors actually may be what has to overactivate to pull me forward. So all of this is where we have to think about. It's all connected, and all of this is what we have to think about before we just start assigning exercises, whether that's for the core, whether that's for upper body mobility, whatever the case may be. So the fundamentals of this, of what we're talking about, is mobility and stability. And that's the fundamentals of movement in general. So we got to think about mobility. And if we go back to what we described earlier, just a second ago, that neuromuscular developmental sequence, how the core develops, what do we have first? We got great mobility. We learn automatically, without any cueing or coaching, we learn to stabilize. Once we learn to stabilize, then we start moving, then we start performing, then we start grabbing and kicking and throwing and running. But we got to go through that process. So again, we need to make sure that we are good in those fundamentals. We are good, we have the requisite amount of mobility and stability. Again, inner, outer core, we got to have that good inner core to allow the outer core to do what it needs to do. So we're still talking about core training, but we're taking a little bit different approach. So what we need to have in order for the core to be efficient, to function properly, we got to have good mobility and motor control, we got to have good energy transfer, and we need to have good breathing. In order for us to move appropriately, all these things need to occur. Now, what happens if it's dysfunctional? Well, if there's problems with any of those things, we create compensations. Now, these compensations are how we get through our daily lives. Just because I've got a lack of ankle mobility doesn't mean I'm not going to run or walk or jump or do what I need to do. It just means I'm going to compensate around that lack of ankle mobility. My glutes may not do as much as they should do. My hip flexors may have to do more. I'm just going to change my movement patterns. I'm going to change my motor program in order to move around those problems. So if we look at a person in a half kneeling position, same scenario, looks really good in this half kneeling position. And again, this is a pretty high-level athlete. So we would assume, hey, we need to train this person. We need to get her really good and stable. We need to give her some core training to help stabilize her. She's pretty mobile. But again, by having her in this position, we can see pretty good. But as soon as she goes into that opposite half-kneeling position, she has significant problems. So again, we don't want to make assumptions that just because they're an athlete, just because they even have six-pack abs, that they don't have a proper functioning core. So aesthetics sometimes and their history can sometimes cloud us and make us assume that we don't need to do certain activities. Don't make that assumption. Do some screening, do some basic testing to confirm where they are. Then we have a better idea of what we need to do next. So what makes the core dysfunctional is some asymmetries or problems in the fundamentals of mobility and motor control, but also pain. A person who has pain, we know through research that that's going to alter the motor control system. That's going to alter your neuromuscular system, create compensation. Pain in my ankle may disrupt what's going on in my core. Pain in my shoulder is going to disrupt what happens in my core. The timing, the sequencing, those inner core muscles that we described will not function properly. So again, the assumption sometimes, okay, the prime example right now is low back pain. A person has low back pain, we make the assumption that, hey, we're going to do some core activity to help that low back pain out. Well, it may or may not work. It may not be because they've got core dysfunction. It may be a problem somewhere else in the body that's causing them to have back pain. And doing just some core training is not going to fix the underlying issue. We have to figure out what's the underlying issue if we want to put them on the right path forward. We're talking about starting fundamentally and building you up. That's what's going to allow us to have much more impact long term. So let's just think about some fundamental principles. Let's make sure you get good mobility first. Let's check mobility in and throughout the body. Because again, think about this example. If a person has poor hip mobility, and they bend down to pick something up, they really should be hinging at the hips. But if they don't have good hip mobility, they're not going to be able to hinge as well, which means they're going to have to sacrifice stability in and around the spine to bend down or squat down. And that's going to create problems. So we need to first make sure we have good mobility, because good mobility allows the proprioceptive system to work better. Go back to our baby. Go back to how we developed. What do we have first? Great mobility. We then learn to stabilize it. So we learn to stabilize it. Now, this doesn't mean one is more important than the other. This simply means that we got to have good mobility, we got to have good stability, but if we don't have good mobility, let's start there and get that mobility. We've got to have both. And just because a person has, say, a limited leg raise or limited toe touch, that may be a stability problem. We may have to do stability activities to get that problem corrected. So motor control is reflex driven, so static and dynamic. Let's start statically, put you in a position where you can control your posture and position before we just start having you move through that posture and position. Again, very fundamental thinking. But finally, we got to strength train. And I think this is one of the things that maybe irritates me the most, is people assume we just need to prescribe corrective exercise for certain people. Not at all. Corrective exercise and some of the things we're going to talk about today are only done to get you to strength train. We only want to do that to allow us to get you to where you're training at a higher level. We don't want to just prescribe a bunch of corrective exercises, because then that's just a workout with a bunch of low-level exercises. We got to strength train you. We got to push you to a higher level to continue to build that foundation and continue to create better performance. So which brings us to, how do we start? What do we do? Well, again, you're tuning into FMS, so we're going to follow our standard operating procedure. We're going to start by screening you, taking you through some very movement-based tests to see where you are. Because I'm not going to make assumptions. I'm not going to just assume just because you walk in with your shirt off, you got six-pack abs, you walk in and you're really buff, doesn't mean you're in shape. Okay, you could have pain. You could have significant amounts of mobility limitations. You could have some significant stability limitations. You may be extremely strong and powerful, but those fundamentals underneath the hood, so to speak, aren't doing what they need to do. So we're just going to start with fundamentals. So if we look at somebody who just has a poor squat, and this video is great because, again, this person is a very high-level athlete. So we don't want to make assumptions just because they're a high-level athlete that they can move very well. And this doesn't mean they can't train, doesn't mean they can't go play. It simply means it's going to give me a better idea of what I need to be doing next. What's my next step? And again, let's not go through every part of this person's squat and break it down and put the microscope, okay, he's got an ankle problem. He's got tight IT bands. He's got weak glutes. He's got tightness in his upper body. All those things could be the problem. But let's think simple. Let's go back to just basics. What does this person really need to be doing now? They need to not be squatting. We don't want to load this person's squat. So the first order of business is changing up their workout if squats are part of the workout. So that's how we need to be thinking about this. So my next thinking is, okay, they can't squat. Okay, fine. Let's make sure we avoid squatting in the weight room. And now we can look at our overall profile of the rest of our 7 tests or 6 tests, better determine what the problem is. Maybe his ankles are bad, maybe his ankles move well, maybe it's hip. So we can look at all those things, but we're taking a movement pattern approach. But let's be honest, would core training help this individual? Maybe not. If the ankles are tight and locked up and his foot and his ankle don't work very well, then his core doesn't matter. We got to start. The biggest opportunity to where we want to go is where we want to start. What can I give that individual in that video right now today that's going to help them the most? We want to find, hey, let's take the rock out of the shoe first before we go run. Where is this guy's rock? Is it his ankles? Is it his hips? Is it his back? I don't know. I'm just sitting looking at a squat. The first thing I got to do is make sure he doesn't continue to load it, which is going to continue to create problems. So the whole idea behind screening is to create that opportunity. Identify areas that we can focus. Find the 1 or 2 things that are going to give you the biggest impact. And really, you should think about this not just in movements or core training that we're talking about today, but in everything. Even with nutrition. If you do something that's taking a hip-to-waist ratio or look at someone's BMI and it's high, then there's some simple recommendations you can make. And the first one will be, okay, let's talk about what you currently do in your diet and maybe remove some of those things. You can tell them, hey, you should be eating your greens. You should be putting this or that in your diet. But if they're still going and drinking a big gulp 5 times a day, well, maybe that's the advice you should be giving that person first. So the opportunity we're looking at, generally speaking, and apply this principle to what you're doing in a lot of different things, is does the person have a significant dysfunction? Do they have just a dysfunction? It's not really not that bad. Or are they moving or functioning pretty well? So again, significant dysfunction in the example I just said could be that they're grossly obese. Well, if they're grossly obese, they probably need, in my opinion, if it's a person I'm working with, probably more advice than I can give them. So I may need to pull in someone else who can help me prescribe a better program for that individual. But what I can do is find out what they're doing in their current nutritional habits or behaviors that we could remove. So that's the type of thinking we want to do, because that's what screening does. It puts you in these categories and tells me 2 things. What is good? What do I not need to worry about? And what are the things I need to worry about? And once I identify the things I need to worry about, there's my opportunity. That's what I want to focus on. Give you things that, 1, remove what I know is bad for you, and then insert some things that are good for you. But lo and behold, the things that you're doing well, let's just push you further. So that's the type of thinking we want to do. And really, that's resource allocation. And I love talking about resource allocation because none of us have enough time, have enough equipment. You know, we all want more time, more equipment, more this, more that to work with our people. But right here, use your head better. Think about looking at what the person doesn't need to be doing. What does this person that just came in not need to worry about? If a gymnast walks in the door, I feel pretty confident that gymnast doesn't need to be doing any stretching. Their mobility is pretty good. So why waste time with that person in the gym doing that? A person walks in that's really big and they look, their arms are huge, their arms are about the size of my waist. Why would I worry about doing a lot of strength training with that person? They can do that on their own. So we can use this opportunity, this screening, this standard operating procedure to point us in the right direction, which now will tell us, hey, this is what I've got to focus on. I'm not too worried about that. And with right now, with so much going on, I want to know, what do I need to spend my most time and energy and effort on? And what do I not need to be spending my time and energy and effort on? And that's resource allocation. And I think that's a very powerful message if you really give it some thought. So let's talk about movement. Let's talk about core training. Let's get back to what we're really doing. Again, same type of process. We want to figure out where's our biggest opportunity. If the person moves well, great. Let's keep you down that path. Now let's try to look at some different core training exercises that are just good, that we know are good. It could be some planks. It could be some different things, chops, lifts, swings, some higher level activities if they're doing well. But what if they got some problems? What if we look at that kid earlier that couldn't squat? Well, again, let's protect them, remove the activities that we know are harmful or are not going to be good, and let's fix the problem. Let's correct them. What if they've got pain? They've got significant issues. That same thing, that person who's grossly obese, I need a little help. Person's in pain, you may need a little help. You may have the skills, if you're a medical professional, to figure out what's causing that low back pain. Is it a hip problem? Is it an ankle problem? Is it an upper back problem? What's causing that shoulder problem? Is it a neck problem? Identifying the underlying issue and treat it. And here's a misconception. People say, or people assume that when I say get it treated, doesn't mean they can't train. It simply means there's certain things that may be contraindicated. And you need to know, if you're in the fitness, strength and conditioning world, what exercises are contraindicated if the person's got back pain, if the person has ankle pain. And just get some of that advice. They can still come in and work out. That's not what we're saying. But you need to figure out what that underlying issue is if you want to set a better foundation for long-term success. This is about long-term success. I know we're in a society where everybody wants, here it is now, I want it now, I want it now. We need to be thinking a little bit differently because we're health and fitness professionals. Put them on a better track so they're healthy when they're 80 and they're not having problems. So screening creates this opportunity. So we look at movement screening. We got our 7 tests. Identify the area that we need to focus on. In this example, a person has a bad leg raise. So already know if you've got a bad leg raise, you maybe have some hip mobility problems, and you probably have some lumbopelvic control issues. So those are areas we may want to focus on. But we also need to identify areas that the person should not be training. A bad leg raise probably shouldn't be doing any deadlifts, at least not now. That's the other thing. We're talking about a short term. I don't want you to do this exercise today or over the next week. Let's get you lined up, get you dialed in, then we can bring those things back in, but let's do it in a very systematic process. So screen, identify this function, prescribe the exercises. But let's try to prescribe the exercise or exercises that give us the greatest impact. Don't just arbitrarily choose an exercise. Let's make sure we've set this person up. Well, I can pull this one exercise or two exercises off the shelf, so to speak, and it's going to give me the biggest impact. Ultimately, I'm not prescribing the exercises to quote-unquote fix a leg raise. I'm prescribing an exercise to get me on the right path for success. So these are just common fundamental principles that we need to be considering whether you're training somebody's hips, back, or in this case, the core. So, Noah went through a lot of information right there. Now let's take some questions. So first question. Oh man, this is pretty common. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that get this. So right now, my client comes in wanting six-pack abs. Why do I need to go through all of these principles I guess I just described, all the screening, all this information, if all they want are six-pack abs? Well, we all want six-pack abs. I want six-pack abs, but I like the whiskey and the wine a little too much. So six-pack abs is what we're searching for. You know what? Six-pack abs is more, to me, about diet and about some of maybe even genetics. But that doesn't mean we can't train you to get that. So we got to think about diet. We got to have that conversation. We got to have the conversation that, you know, some people may just carry more of that fat tissue around their waist. I like to blame my parents for that issue. But let's talk about that, because you've got to have that conversation. And yes, we want to get you six-pack abs, but we got to make sure fundamentally that we have the right foundation. And I think that's where screening can actually create that awareness. When you take someone through a screen and they realize, wow, my single leg stance is horrible. This shoulder and that shoulder move differently. Then that opens up the door to have the conversation. Hey, if we really want your core functioning properly, we got to get these fundamental aspects dialed in a little bit better so we can then have you doing higher level activities that will hopefully get you those six-pack abs. Now, question two. If I have a client that struggles to balance in single leg stance, and I'm having them perform a stepping exercise along with hip mobility exercise, let me read this again. If I have a client that struggles to balance in single leg stance, and having them perform stepping exercise along with hip mobility exercises is useful in improving balance in single leg stance. So I guess what we're saying here is if you got a person that has single leg stance, you're assuming you're going to start doing some stepping exercises with some hip mobility exercises. Well, here's what we have to do. We need to make sure that we actually start at the right spot. So if a person, let's go back to that video, and maybe hopefully I get this question right. If this person has a significant single leg stance problem, then the worst thing we can do is try to just get them to do single leg stance. We need to break them down. One, let's make sure is it a single leg stance problem? Is it a upper back mobility problem? Is it an ankle mobility problem? We may need to be doing that to improve their single leg stance. But just giving you an exercise and cueing you through it, saying, okay, stand up nice and tall, or Lordy, have you stand on a BOSU when you got problems with single leg stance. We need to break you down. We need to actually regress you. And I think that's the big thing. Let's regress you, take you back down to a more fundamental position. Remember, we didn't start standing. We started on the floor. So let's use that type of thinking, that core neuromuscular developmental sequence. So single leg stance, let's get back to half kneeling. If they have problems in half kneeling, maybe go down to the floor and do some quadruped, do some rolling, do some crawling. Those things actually may build you up to single leg stance. So really, in that instance, talk about regressing instead of just arbitrarily trying to work on their single leg stance in the same pattern. So next question, how do you prioritize exercise selection? So really, that's what we're talking about. We want to figure out what does the person need, and we have to do that through some type of screening, some type of assessment to determine which exercise is going to be the biggest benefit. If this person has a leg raise problem, but let's say they have a good squat. So if they got a good squat, they got a leg raise problem, well, then we can go and do squat. We can load the squats, but we need to focus on the leg raise. So there's certain activities that I would want to do for their leg raise, maybe some very fundamental core engagement, maybe some leg lowering, some things that we may even go to here in a few seconds or a few minutes to do that. But that's where our assessments and our screens come into play to help us really prioritize what we need to be doing with the person and what exercise makes the most sense. That's part of our problem. We've got access to thousands and thousands of exercises. We've got to figure out which one is going to make the most sense for this person. We've got to consider what are their goals, who the person is, how do they test and do screening when we look at that. Do they have any pain? All of that will help us determine which exercise is the best. There's no favorite exercise. The favorite exercise, the one that's giving me the biggest outcome. And again, that's where our feedback from screening comes into play. Identify the problem, give an exercise, go back and rescreen to see if it fixed the problem. But all of this is about creating a better overall experience for the person. And that goes back to that single leg stance problem. If a person has a single leg stance problem, and you just focus in on that and ask them to stand on a BOSU where you have a band and you're pulling them every direction, that's not going to be a good experience for them. They're not going to learn. You're overloading the proprioceptive system. They've already showed you they have an issue. So what we need to do is, okay, you got an issue here. I know you struggle with single leg stance, so let's break you down and regress you and build you back up. And I think what we want to do to create that overall experience is create some self-awareness. By creating some self-awareness, they know they've got a problem, right versus left, or mobility or stability, whatever the case may be. If we can show them that they've got an issue, they're more likely to buy in. Then we can regress. Then we can look at focusing on quality movement. We can have that conversation a little bit easier. At least that's been in my experience, especially working with athletes. Showing a person that they've got issues in this side and how much better they are on this side versus that side makes it a whole lot easier conversation than just saying, oh, we got to work on your core stability. Well, what is core stability? Well, then you can start saying, well, hey, you got movements here, there, because ultimately creating that quality movement, creating that good foundation, and then getting you to subconscious function, meaning where you're not thinking about it. I don't want to get you to always punch your glutes and say, fire your glutes, fire your glutes, fire your glutes, because that's a problem. That's not how we need to ultimately get to where we are learning, to where we are automatically, reflex stabilization, automatically doing what we need to do. So that's the process. So creating that better experience sometimes, and again, this is a difficult one for us to consider in this profession, is actually stop cueing so much. Start yelling, stop yelling at the person. If you want a person to squat lower, they may not have any idea what you're asking them to do. Sit back, get your knees out, do this, do that. You're overloading them because they proprioceptively, neuromuscularly don't know what to do. And then you start talking about muscles and this, and you got to fire this, you got to activate that. That's going to, again, not put them in the right position to have success. They're overloaded. We got to break them down and give them an opportunity to succeed. If we give them an opportunity to succeed at an activity where they turn on everything automatically, that's a much better way to learn. Put someone in half kneeling and just step away. Let them get in half kneeling, step away, and just say, control your breathing. And you may see them, the light bulbs turn on, so to speak, where they feel like, oh, I got it. And they just breathe and try to relax, and that's where those reflex stabilizers start to turn on. And that's one of the things we want to do by creating a better experience. Putting the person in a position where they can have some success is where you get that long-term buy-in. So that's one thing we want to do. And if we magnify the problem, it's going to allow that to happen. So look at this example, great example right here. 3 times in a row, we told this individual, hey, just step over the string, straight up and over. Don't let your leg go outside these 2 bars. Straight up and over. And 3 times in a row, he swung that leg around. Now let me ask you this. Do you think this person's core is functioning properly? They've got a 6-pack abs, but they've got some problems with their functioning core. Maybe it's a hip mobility problem, maybe it's a single leg stance problem, excuse me. Not sure what the problem is, but they're not moving efficiently. And lo and behold, him seeing this, him understanding that this is a big problem between the right and the left, he's now more aware, so now he's much more likely to follow some protocols that we give him, some exercise strategies that we give him to fix this issue. So self-assessments are another way that we can utilize this type of thinking. And actually, what has been shown is that self-assessments or certain experiences increase motivation and increase long-term exercise adherence. And this is what we're really all going after. I want to get the person motivated. I want to show them some success. I want to create some competency in the exercises I'm going to so they can do it right, and long-term, give them that path forward where they can just do some self-checks. And what we have found, some of our experiences, people get it. People start to say, wow, I can't touch my right toe, but I can touch my left toe. We give them some exercises, now they can touch both toes. Now, granted, tomorrow, the next day, they may go right back to that old motor program where they've got a poor toe touch on one and not a poor toe, and a good toe touch on the other. Well, if we give them the right recipe, they can now self-monitor, they can continue to progress based off what we're giving them. So again, just some real easy things we can do. So we want to create some exposure. We want to identify through basic screening, here's the area of problem. Now we want to get you in a position where you can experience it. And really, that's one of the objectives of corrective exercise. Create that awareness, create that experience, so you have a better idea of what it's supposed to feel like or what it doesn't feel like. And let's get you on that right path. So again, she knows what it should feel like. If you get somebody half kneeling, hey, get down on one knee. They're always going to get down on the better side and then have them switch. And again, you're talking about a female athlete right here in this video, a runner. Now, what do you think she's doing to her body if she's running over a long period of time as a cross-country runner? She's really creating a lot of stress on the system. Now, again, I'm not saying it's a stability problem. I don't really know what the problem is by simply looking at this video. That's the purpose of getting more of a global or movement profile. But again, she now understands, because we gave her that awareness of what she needs to be feeling as we move on into her exercise programming. So again, a lot of us, most all of us, have some type of subconscious dysfunction. These are compensations. These are our workarounds, so to speak, areas of weakness. So let's take that subconscious dysfunction and put you in a position where it becomes aware, conscious dysfunction. Ultimately, all right, now I know I've got this problem in single leg stance or half kneeling. Now let's go back and see, how do I work through that? That's conscious function. And ultimately creating that subconscious function. So now we want to be able to do it without thinking about it. I want to be able to get down in half kneeling and do some type of activity without thinking of which muscle's got to fire or what I got to do, this and that. I don't have to worry about breathing. Hey, I want to get down in half kneeling and throw a ball, do some type of chopper lift. And now I'm not thinking. So we have to go through this process. But again, starting with that awareness is a really important piece. So magnify the problem. Put you in a position where, whether it's half kneeling, going through ankle mobility, again, your screens and tests and things we do initially should point us in the right direction. Breathing is an important aspect. So in this sideline position, breathing can help us remove that high threshold. Now, going back to our core training, that high threshold is a lot of times those outer core muscles staying on too much. The lats, some of these obliques, our rectus abdominis, kind of in that splinting kind of thing. That's what we gotta have to break through. We gotta break through that splinting effect or that high threshold strategy if we really want the core to function properly. If we really want those inner core muscles to be turning on and turning off like they're supposed to be, that reflex stability. Breathing will help us do that. Different postures and positions, and ultimately getting you up to standing. So here's the recipe once we've identified an area that we need to focus on. That's just a recipe we want to follow. Make you aware, breathe through some of that high threshold, and ultimately get you moving through that pattern so we can have some success, because ultimately, we've got to train it. We've got to move through this process as quickly as possible so we can train you. So, all of that to get to, let's talk about actual exercise, and let's use the principles we just laid out to talk about training the core. And what I want to talk about today is something that gets overlooked a lot in what I believe in the fitness world, personal training. People avoid deadlifting. People feel like they're going to hurt the person, but deadlifting, really hinging of the hip, is an extremely important activity to have people do, no matter who they are, no matter if they're older, younger, no matter what activity level they're at. We can find them in the right place to start. And that's the whole idea. So you're not going to be able to start a lot of people by doing a deadlift and hinging their hips right, keeping their back stable, keeping their upper body in a good position. You may have to regress them and build them up to deadlifting. And that's what I want to talk about right now. But what is deadlifting? It's hip hinging. Early in my career, I had a physician. I was doing a lot of some rehabbing, some ACL athletes, and I had them doing some hip hinging. And the physician got word of that, and he said, deadlifting. Physician heard I was deadlifting these athletes, went crazy, called me, kind of got on me and said, Lee, you can't be deadlifting these kids. They're post-op. And again, I knew the protocols. And I told him, I said, okay, we'll just work on some hip hinging. And sure enough, as soon as I said hip hinging, he was fine. He said, all right, no problem. So again, use hip hinging as the word if people are intimidated by deadlifting. But look at these two videos right here. This is just how we can utilize that neurodevelopmental sequence that we talked about earlier, that we can regress. Because again, I've got two great kids here, they're mine, that take after their mother, simply doing deadlifting. They are hinging up the hips. Two very different activities that because of their age, they don't have a lot of these problems. They don't have any pain. They don't have any limitations in their mobility. They put together the neuromuscular system. They utilize their mobility. They then connect the dots, and you can see, especially my son on the video on the left picking up the ball, you see him get everything connected. He gets that tibia vertical and lifts it straight up. My daughter on the other side slamming that down, she knows she's not strong enough to use her arms, but she uses those hips. And this is a very natural process. This is what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to our people that we train, get to this same area where we don't have to coach them so much, that we get them in a place where they subconsciously function. And that's what these two kids right here are demonstrating. So we want to talk about deadlifting and squatting, because deadlifting and squatting need or use a hip hinge. So let's talk about how we work through this process. So one, we got to check the movement competency. The leg raise and toe touches are two great ways to ensure that we have the requisite amount of stability and mobility to deadlift. And again, we're not going to go and throw a bunch of weight on the person, even if they've got the requisite amount of mobility and stability. We got to start at a lower level. But a leg raise and a toe touch both demonstrate good lumbopelvic control with hip mobility. Stand up into a toe touch. When you stand up into a toe touch, if you do it correctly, the first thing that should occur is that you sit back. You hinge at those hips. So when you hinge at those hips, you're now using hip mobility. You're using lumbopelvic control. Then you go into spinal flexion to touch your toes, but you try to use all that hip mobility, lumbopelvic control before you actually flex the spine. And we're actually doing the same thing with our active straight leg raise. We're really doing the same test, but now having you lay on your back, spine supported, we're looking at that lower body a little bit more, and then we're looking at how well you separate the right and the left. Is there an asymmetry? Asymmetries cause a lot of problems. So once we do that, once we've ensured that you're ready, because if you're not ready, again, deadlifting is off the table. We need to build you up, and we'll talk about that process here in a second. But if your leg raise is good, your toe touch is good, let's load it. Now I know I'm ready to go do that. So again, it's not always about corrective exercise. Now that you've proven you've got the requisite amount of fundamental mobility and stability, now we have to strengthen it. Now we've got to go and do a strengthening activity, whether that's a straight bar, whether it's two arms, whether it's single leg, double leg. That's where you come in and you make that decision based off the person, the individual, what their goals are. So first, we look at different postures and patterns. We look at breathing. So we got to make sure that if we have a person who has an issue, let's start on the ground. So if a person's got a poor leg raise, let's start them on the floor. Let's work on breathing to work through some of that high threshold and know that different postures and patterns are what we need to do. So we can start in that supported spine position, going back to our neurodevelopmental process. We start in a spine-supported position. We're going to do that right here in our Bretzel stretch. Now, a lot of these videos you have access to, so you go to our website, go to our exercise library, and you can check out some of these videos. But we start, and the key here is breathe, but focus on your breathing. It's not just sets and reps. So in the video, you see as he rotates, he's going to get to an in-range of motion. Once he gets to the in-range of motion, cycle a breath and go a little further. In-range of motion, cycle a breath, relax. Again, what happens? You get to the in-range of motion, and the first thing that happens, you get into that high threshold state. You go, ah! You lock up. Breathe. Move through it. Breathe. Move through it. And again, different postures and positions. So now we go from a supported spine position to what I would say is a suspended spine position where we work through the same process. So again, the focus in these activities is very fundamental, but again, we're still doing this to give us better hip, lumbopelvic control to get us to where we want to get, which is our hip hinge. So we start very fundamental. So now we go to a suspended spine position. So again, in this position, actually is working on our hip mobility around a very stable spine. And this is a great activity. Believe me, I know how it looks. It doesn't look that great, but it works really, really well for a person who's got some stability issues in that lumbopelvic area and lumbar spine. Because as soon as you rock back into that ball, that loading of the spine from the ground up Think about that. That's how we learn to stabilize. Babies were sitting. They were sitting upright, so they're loading the spine from the ground up. What do we do in training? Well, we take weight, put it in our hands, now we're loading the spine from the top down. Well, let's go back to the fundamentals. Let's load the spine from the ground up, and that's what's happening here. And just giving you some feedback with that roll on the back, making sure you keep the spine in a good position as you load it. So there's a lot going on here, really good activity, but think about this. This is a squat. This is hinging of the hips. That's all this is in a very more fundamental place. So again, we're not saying this is all you can do, but if we're working on getting that good hip mobility, lumbar spine, pelvic control, get you through your breathing, do some supported, go right into some activity like in a suspended position, like a crawling as an example. Then we go right into a stacked or loaded position. And we're going to create a little circuit like this. Now, not everybody has to start in a supported spine position. If you're moving pretty well, you could potentially have the person start right here, where they can go into some stacked or loaded positions. So now, for a person who's got a half kneeling problem, person who has a half kneeling problem, we may want to go and focus on half kneeling, but if they got a significant problem, what would we do? We would go back to that supported position, suspended position. So again, I'm showing you a little progression for spinal positions. So if the person is struggling in half kneeling, or in this example, tall kneeling, if they're really struggling, don't force it. Give them a kettlebell, have them do a halo in this example to see if that can self-correct. Have them breathe, but they're really, really struggling because any exercise every exercise should be designed to challenge the person, but not challenge them so much that they can't figure it out. They can't learn automatically, because that's what we do with some of the bands. That's what we're doing in this with the halo. We're giving you something to react to where they can almost self-correct. They're creating some awareness in this position. You change into the other side. But if it's too challenging, if they're really struggling, don't do what a lot of us do. We go in there and start coaching. We start putting our hands on them. Just go down to a suspended spine position. Go down to where they're doing some crawling activities, quadruped activities, maybe even rolling or that supported spine position. Regress them there until they have some success, and then come back and try something in a higher level spine position like stacked or loaded. And ultimately, standing. A toe touch progression is a great way to work that hip hinge in. And this may be all you need to do. For a person who has a poor toe touch, you may just be able to go right into this toe touch progression where you're manipulating the weight shift. So with the toes up, I'm simply forcing a posterior weight shift where, again, what's the first thing that has to happen? Toes are up, automatically, without me saying anything, you hinge your hips. Put the heels up, same thing. Now I'm getting shifted forward or anteriorly. So what's the first thing that happens? Before you move, you hinge your hips backward. So again, we're simply using a weight shift to give us that automatic response. And that's where we talk about reactive neuromuscular training. I'm reacting to maybe a kettlebell. I'm reacting to a weight shift. And based off that reaction, I want to contract the muscles in the right sequence. So again, reflex stabilization. React and respond to your environment to do the right thing. That's what we're trying to get to, because that's how we learn. We don't learn by having me give you too many cues or coaching techniques. We learn by, hey, figuring it out. How did a baby learn to walk? Well, they stood up and they fell a few times, and they stood up and they realized, you know what? If I balance my head, I get my center of gravity in the right place, they figure it out. We're simply using those same concepts. We're trying to improve your movement patterns. And ultimately, once we get that toe touch, once we get that hip hinge, let's hip hinge. We got to get to where you're training the person. Now again, I just walked through quite a few exercises, but the idea is to give you 2, maybe 3, maybe 1 that connects the dots where you get the right response to where you can automatically go up and start training. So I can't sit here and tell you it's going to take this exercise or that exercise. Create that awareness, create that recipe, see if they got a toe touch, see if the leg raise improves, then go right into start training it. Because ultimately, this is what's going to help us maintain it. So once we lose it, get it back. Use our fundamental principles to get it back. Once we got it, the only way to maintain it is if we train it. So whether we do single leg, double leg, using some bands. So again, using a band to pull the knee in actually creates better awareness. It forces you to put the hip and the knee and the ankle in the right place. It's activating the core. So just simply having you pull a band around it, the person's struggling, so they're opening up, they're rotating out of it, simply pull them in a little bit, and you'll get that activation that you want. You can do the same thing here with the upper body, rotating them out of it with the band, but ultimately training them. So a single arm, single leg deadlift is that more dynamic. It's creating that rotation. So you're overloading the system with rotation. So what the neuromuscular system is going to do, it's going to work overtime to create better positioning of the hip, the knee, and the ankle, and the spine by just giving you that over rotation. That's what a single arm, single leg will do, which is great if that's what you're going for. So we want to start and make sure you can control yourself dynamically, lower weight, but higher rotation. So this would be more of a motor control biased activity with one arm, one leg, versus one leg, two arms. Now we're just strength training because you get that one force going down. You're not over rotating the person. So again, let's make sure you can do it. You can start by doing some dynamic if they got some problems, and then go right into strength training. We got to get you strength training. But don't assume you have to go all the way to the floor. I just got this question on I think on Instagram, how far or where do you start? Start up high. Start up at knee level with the weight, and then move it down. And maybe you don't need to go to the floor. Maybe go to shin level, maybe mid shin, maybe just below mid shin with the weight, and pick it up, put it on a chair, especially your older clients. Get that hip hinge. The hip hinge is the key, and then load it. You're moving this weight with your posterior chain, not your arms. And don't forget about the upper body. Again, just did a post on Instagram a couple days ago. Make sure you get that upper body, because if you start rounding the upper body, your core is not doing what it needs to do. We're still talking about core training, but we're talking about core training, the hips, the core, and the upper body. Everything is connected. And if one part of this is not working right, everything's going to be all screwed up. You're going to create compensations, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So rescreen, make sure once you get the leg raise in this example or toe touch, you want to make sure to rescreen them and get the feedback. The only way you know if an exercise is working is go back and retest to ensure you're on the right track. And again, prescribe some self-activities, some self-screens that the person can do, such as a toe touch, such as a squat, to ensure they're actually self-aware and they're monitoring their own progress. If a person has a poor toe touch today, you give them the exercises where you know the toe touch is better, what's a good chance they're going to lose it? That's okay. Now they got to wait something at home that they can do to fix it, and something at home that they can do to make sure it stays fixed. So again, these are just some simple things. But again, think about the big picture here. Let's identify where we need to start, identify things that we know the person can do, prescribe some exercises to ensure that we put them on the right track fundamentally, okay? So now let's take some questions. So, in a large-scale training environment, are there some big bang for your buck core exercises that you prescribe to almost anyone with core dysfunction? So if you've got this is a common problem. You got a team or a big group, and you want to prescribe some activities. One, I would almost look at what's the group. What type of group is there? Are they younger individuals, older individuals? Are they have a sport that they try to do? It may be more mobility activities that you may need to prescribe, because again, if they got poor hip, poor T-spine mobility, the core is not going to function properly. If they're a group that are typically more hypermobile, then certainly planks, quadruped diagonals, just some very traditional activities. But again, think of it going down, taking a step and regressing down. Half kneeling activities, doing some different, one-arm pushes and pulls and half kneeling. Those are ways that the core you can give a person to create better core function. So again, from there you can progress up to higher, but it's hard to say without knowing an environment. If it's an older, kind of just a general population environment, we know that ankle mobility is a problem, hip mobility is a problem, and even upper back mobility is a problem. So even though we're talking about core training, we've got to make sure that we can get good mobility. So maybe giving them one good mobility activity, like a bretzel, and one good stability activity, maybe like a quadruped diagonal or even crawling. So, next question. When you're working regressions in the single leg deadlift pattern, you mentioned regress in the half kneeling. What would be in the case or example of focusing more on hip core deficiency? Well, if they've got problems in half kneeling, that's the thing. I already know they've got hip and core deficiency. So the female athlete in the in the video who was on that half kneeling, she had problems in a half kneeling on that one side. She's going to have to compensate. She's already telling me she's got core dysfunction. So I've got two choices. One, I can maybe give her some activity in half kneeling to see if she can self-correct, kind of move through it just like your baby does walking, or when they begin to walk, kind of position themselves in the right place. Put them in, maybe do a halo or something, or regress them to a suspended spine position, maybe in a quadruped diagonal, maybe that quadruped movement we showed with the pushing back into the ball, maybe crawling activities. So regress them to a different spinal position or posture rather than just over-coaching them in the half kneeling. But try the half kneeling and maybe give them a chop or lift or halo or something or turn, maybe a good thing to kind of self-corrects. So next question. If someone has poor squat due to decreased ankle mobility, but is caused by the mechanics of the ankle, not soft tissue, what would you recommend to help correct their form? So again, if you've identified ankle mobility as being the problem, there's some different ankle strategies you could do. One, try a basic exercise. We've got a couple of exercises on our site in half kneeling, maybe doing some ankle glides with a dowel or even a kettlebell, some basic strategies just to see if ankle improvement happens. If it doesn't happen, and if you really assume or making the assumption that it's more of ankle, don't hesitate to refer them. Get some better insight. If the ankle's been locked up, maybe due to a previous injury, and it's been locked up for a while, you may need to get somebody to help you out who's good at maybe doing some manipulations or things, and like a chiropractor, physical therapist. Because if they got significant limitations, that's one thing the researcher also says. You got significant limitations, just prescribing certain exercises may not always help. You may actually have to get and do some deeper assessments, deeper things. But try the exercise and see if it works. Again, that's where the rescreening comes back into play, is it will determine if the exercise worked. And if it doesn't work, find that out as fast as possible so you can do something different. So, thanks for joining us today. Be sure to check out the description below for the exclusive promo code. We're offering a significant discount. I'm not sure the staff got the approval to do that significant discount, but hey, we're doing it. So if you've ever wanted to take some of our online courses, now's the time. Take advantage of these savings. Please like, share, and subscribe, and be sure to stay in touch with us on social and through functionalmovement.com. We'd love to hear your feedback and what you guys are up to. Thanks again.